Each week on Culinary Confidential, Christina Cates, a seasoned foodie who has worked at some of New York City's top restaurants, will share her passion for the culinary world. Whether you're a professional chef, a restaurant enthusiast, or a lover of good food, Christina dives into the heart of hospitality, exploring the trends, triumphs, and challenges facing the food service profession. And you won't want to miss her chats with some of the most interesting and influential industry voices. And now, please take your seat at the table as Culinary Confidential with Christina Cates starts now, exclusively on AM 970, The Answer.
Welcome to Culinary Confidential with Christina Cates. This show is produced in association with Lucas A. Ferrara and Shake It Off Live. Tonight, we're closing out a series that has taken us through 250 years of American food and drink. This has been the Americana 250 series. All month long, we've traced how this country ate and drank its way from the colonial era to right now, from 1776 to 2026. And for our final episode, we're saving one of the richest, messiest, and most misunderstood chapters in that history, Prohibition. For 13 years, from 1920 to 1933, the United States made it illegal to manufacture, sell, or transport alcohol. However, consuming alcohol remained legal. It was supposed to be the dawn of a sober, virtuous nation. Instead, it became one of the great case studies in unintended consequences in American history. Americans didn't stop drinking. They just got creative about it. Speakeasies flourished behind unmarked doors and coded knocks. Bathtub gin became both a punchline and a survival skill, distilled in basements and bathrooms with whatever equipment people could get their hands on. Doctors wrote an astonishing number of prescriptions for medicinal whiskey because, conveniently, that was still legal. And organized crime found a business model so lucrative it would shape American cities, politics, and law enforcement for decades after Prohibition ended. But maybe the most lasting legacy is what happened to the drinks themselves. When you're hiding what you're making, and what you're making is often rough, poorly distilled, occasionally dangerous liquor, you start hiding the taste too. That's where a lot of the cocktail culture we still associate with sophistication and glamour actually comes from. Sweet mixers, fruit juices, and elaborate combinations weren't originally about elevating the drink. They were camouflage. Some historians argue Prohibition didn't kill American drinking culture. It reinvented it from the ground up. And we're still living with the results every single time we order a cocktail instead of a glass of straight spirits. Here are some surprising legal loopholes and fun facts regarding Prohibition. Drinking alcohol itself was never actually illegal under the 18th Amendment. Only the manufacture, sale, or transportation of it, so anything already in your home before the law took effect, was fair game. The Volstead Act allowed doctors to prescribe medicinal whiskey and permitted sacramental wine for religious use. And grape growers got around the ban by selling concentrated grape bricks with suspiciously specific instructions on how not to accidentally turn them into wine. Now let's talk about the scale of the underground economy. By 1925, New York City alone had somewhere between 30,000 and 100,000 speakeasies. That's a broad range, dwarfing the number of legal bars that existed before the ban. A Capitol Hill bootlegger named the Man in the Green Hat made up to 25 liquor deliveries a day to members of Congress and later claimed he helped supply roughly 80% of Congress during Prohibition. And these are the real costs. The federal government deliberately poisoned industrial alcohol that was commonly stolen by bootleggers, hoping to scare people sober, a policy estimated to have killed around 10,000 people. Prohibition cost the federal government roughly $11 billion in lost liquor tax revenue, while costing over $300 million to enforce, since states like New York had relied heavily on liquor taxes for nearly 75% of their budgets before the ban. And here's a fun fact. The Prohibition Party's mascot was a camel, chosen as a symbol that famously goes without a drink, putting it right alongside the Republican elephant and Democratic donkey. Now, to help us sort fact from folklore on all of this, I'm joined again by someone who has spent his entire career in the history and culture of American drinking. Taking a victory lap on the show is my new friend, Noah Rothbaum. He's one of the world's leading authorities on cocktails and spirits. You may recall Noah joined the show back in May. It was so nice he's doing it twice. The whole idea for tonight's show about Prohibition was actually his idea. When he was sitting here last time, I was telling him how I was doing the Americana series in July and said, oh, you should definitely come cover Prohibition. So here we are. Noah is a Kentucky colonel, a James Beard Award winner, and a fellow of the James B. Beam Institute for Kentucky Spirits at the University of Kentucky. Noah is the author of The Business of Spirits and the Art of American Whiskey, and most recently, The Whiskey Bible, a complete guide to the world's greatest spirit that took him deep into libraries and archives, chasing down primary sources most people never knew existed. He's also the associate editor of the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails, a reference book so well regarded it won the American Library Association's prestigious Dartmouth Medal for the Best Reference Book of 2021, on top of Tales of the Cocktail Spirited Award. Before all that, Noah was the founding editor-in-chief of Liquor.com, and he currently serves as editor-at-large for Bartender Magazine and spirits editor for Men's Journal. How accomplished. He's also spent years as a working journalist covering spirits for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Daily Beast, where he edited a section that won back-to-back industry awards for cocktail and spirits coverage. In short, if there's a story buried somewhere in the history of American drinking, there's a very good chance Noah has already found it, fact-checked it, and figured out exactly how to turn it into a great cocktail. So tonight, we're going to talk about how Prohibition actually got started, who really benefited from it once it was the law, and how it permanently reshaped the spirits industry, and why so many of America's most iconic cocktails were essentially born out of necessity and disguise rather than craft. We'll also get into some of the myths, because there are plenty, and try to separate the romantic speakeasy mythology from what was actually happening on the ground. So pour yourself something, legally of course, and let's get into it. Noah, welcome back to the show. I think you can tell by now with all of my social media posts that I'm absolutely obsessed with you. I find you to be so knowledgeable and quite frankly fascinating. So let's talk Prohibition tonight, shall we?
Well, thank you so much for having me back on. I really appreciate it. And, I so enjoyed our first show and the discussion. And I thought, what better time to come back, right? About America 250, obviously the whole year we're going to be celebrating the birth of the country. In reality, I have to say, if you could imagine Congress got something wrong, I know they never do, right? But they did, and what we're talking about specifically today is that they called bourbon America's native spirit, and that's not actually true. If the revolution had gone a different way, you and I would be drinking rum today, right? We'd be British citizens. That's what America was known for. I might not be mad at that, though. No, I mean, rum is delicious. Obviously, I drink a lot. Sugar was kind of like the Bitcoin of the 1700s, right? Like, all of these Europeans had crazy sweet tooths, and they wanted sugar. At the time, you could make sugar from beets. I imagine it probably tasted pretty funky.
Dirty.
Yeah, exactly. Beets have that big earthy note that every time my wife tries to sneak it into a smoothie, I'm like,
tastes like dirt.
No, can't drink this.
Chocolate and dirt.
Right. I don't care what's in here. I taste the beets. So I imagine the sugar was, it's probably sweet but funky, right? And cane sugar is obviously a lot purer and sweeter. So people were obsessed with sugar, right? They had these huge sweet tooths all over Europe. They realized that if they planted sugarcane in the Caribbean, they could harvest all the sugar they could ever want. But when you're making sugar, you're like, what does this have to do with anything? When you're making sugar, the byproduct of making sugar is molasses, right? So it's, my theory of booze is that people make alcohol from whatever is local, right? Whatever they can get their hands on. Grapes, potatoes, grains, old shoes, whatever it is, right? It doesn't matter. They're going to turn into booze. They're thirsty. So people realized, the workers probably, that the molasses would just sort of ferment on its own from wild yeast, and that would turn into alcohol. And if you distilled that, you could make rum, right? So up and down the East Coast of America, there were hundreds of rum distilleries before the Revolution. We were famous for our rum, for our rum drinks. Obviously people drank other things like apple cider too, but rum was what America was known for. Famously, we have the Boston Tea Party, but in reality, we didn't give up drinking tea in America, but we gave up drinking rum, right? So after 1776 and the Revolution, the British are like, you know what? No more molasses for you dummies, right? You want to be part of our empire? No more molasses. Good luck making rum. They were right? It's hard to make rum without molasses or sugarcane. So after the revolution's over, some people went back to making rum, but really in reality, it was a very conscientious and intentional choice that these early Americans, the first Americans, said, We don't want to drink like British people anymore. We're not British. We might sound British, but we are not British.
We're
right?
our own people at this point.
Right, exactly. We have our own destiny. We're going to drink whiskey, right? We're going to drink whiskey. And what kind of whiskey did they make? Rye whiskey, right? And that's something that obviously they brought over from Europe. The earliest settlers in America from the old world were Dutch. They bring with them a lot of distilling knowledge, also rye grain, right? George Washington, after he serves 2 terms in the White House, after he obviously leads our army to victory, then serves 2 terms in the White House, he goes back to his estate, Mount Vernon. His plantation manager, James Anderson, says, you know what, he's Scottish. Let's build a distillery. Like we have.
So he was one of the first distillers, George Washington. Yeah, I mean, first president and first distiller.
Well, I would say first celebrity distiller.
Wow.
Right? Sorry, George Clooney. It wasn't you. It was George Washington. Yeah, he was. I mean, I don't think George actually made any of the whiskey himself. Obviously, it's very labor intensive, but he owned the largest rye distillery at the time, one of the largest distilleries in the country, and for several years until his untimely death, like in the early 1800s, they ran a distillery, and he was known for his rye whiskey. They also made fruit brandies, but that was really how big rye was.
Wait, I gotta interrupt. Do you think any of those bottles still exist somewhere in a basement, in a back closet?
That would be incredible. I mean, after he died, the distillery kind of it closed, and then sort of naturally, sort of just fell apart. And then up until about 20 years ago, Mount Vernon, with a grant from Distilled Spirits Council of the U.S., Discus, rebuilt the distillery. So they're making whiskey there again a little bit, right? The old-fashioned way. But that would be incredible if somebody
absolutely incredible
found some kind of flask or keg, or I mean, at this point, I don't know how much would be left given the evaporation from a barrel. But yeah, I mean, if anybody has one,
give us a call.
Please let us know. But yeah, I mean, the word that we have not used so far really is bourbon, right? And that comes later. I mean, obviously, America is now so famous for bourbon. One of the rules, there are many rules for making bourbon that I won't get into because that will put everybody to sleep. But one of the main and most important rule for our discussion today is that bourbon can only be made in the U.S., right? So starting in the 1960s, Congress, just like champagne can only be made in Champagne, France, or tequila can only be made in a certain area of Mexico, the tequila region. Bourbon can only be made in the U.S. I'm a Kentucky colonel, which is an honorific degree, so I can spill the tea here. If you ask people in Kentucky about the rules for making bourbon, they will say that you can only make bourbon in Kentucky. That's not true. You can make bourbon anywhere, as long as it's in the U.S., right? So, and people do now in all 50 states. But bourbon comes later, right? Rye is actually what most people drank, and the difference between rye and bourbon is that bourbon has to be at least 51% corn, probably now in our modern idea, a little bit of malted barley, and usually rye or wheat. And rye has to be, it's kind of flipped, at least 51% rye. And rye, I feel like, is, like the difference between rye bread and cornbread, right? Rye has like natural spice, and that's why it's so good for deli sandwiches and caraway and mustard. Cornbread obviously has an inherent sweetness from corn, which has a sweeter flavor to it.
Okay, let's set the historical stage, the road to the 18th Amendment, what the law actually banned, and the early loopholes that doomed it from day one.
Yeah.
Okay, before we get into the chaos, let's get the basics straight. How did a country that loved to drink end up amending its own constitution to ban alcohol?
Oh, how many hours do we have?
Just about 30 or 40 more minutes.
I would say that, okay, well, we'll try to keep this lively and succinct. Really, the Temperance movement starts to build, long before Prohibition is enacted, right? It begins really in the 1800s. Different states enact their own prohibition laws. Usually they're repealed. But really, I mean, there are a lot of social issues, a lot of, different political parties. This amazing coalition comes together of the strangest bedfellows, suffragettes who are campaigning for the women's right to vote, Ku Klux Klan, who, doesn't really like immigrants, who thinks that like by banning the production of alcohol, that would deprive immigrants of a means of a job, so that they would have to leave. So you have all these different people, this giant spectrum of beliefs, who are all pushing for the temperance movement, all for the prohibition. And in reality, prohibition starts earlier than we think, right? We all think that it starts after, World War I, that it goes, through the early 30s. But in reality, prohibition really starts during World War I, where the government shuts down the distilleries. They allow beer to still be made. But really, it almost starts, the beginning is during the war. They use the war as an excuse to really shut down the industry. Even after World War I is over, the distilleries sue the government, goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and they're like, why can't we sell booze? The Supreme Court rules, well, the government still can enact wartime privilege because the war's just over, and basically it allows the government to pass through the Volstead Act, right, and then the amendment to the Constitution, which bans not the consumption, which is interesting.
Right, which I didn't actually know until I started preparing for this show.
Right. I mean, it's fascinating because, so it bans the production, the sale, and the transportation. Part of the reason why they couldn't ban the consumption was that legitimately doctors prescribed alcohol for a range of maladies, right? Like they thought it was a cure-all, right, for a lot of things. So that was like a drug, considered to be a legitimate drug. So much so that the government allows a handful of brands to get essentially a license to bottle, not produce, but bottle medicinal whiskey, right? Which then came in a flask, and you would need a prescription from your doctor, dentist, to go to the pharmacy, who would then give you the medicinal whiskey. And so much was sold that like a lot of these giant pharmacy chains that we have today, their roots are from Prohibition because there's a huge amount of business they were getting. So much medicinal whiskey is sold that the brands who have this very rare and lucrative bottling license, the government has to declare a distiller's holiday so that they're allowed to replenish their stocks. We also see a lot of consolidation of the industry where the medicinal whiskey bottlers are buying up their rivals in order to get access to their supplies, right? So that because they're running out of booze, essentially, and they can't make any more. So it's a really fascinating time. I found a bottle for my book, The Art of American Whiskey, of Four Roses that was sold from a photo of, not the actual bottle, that was in their archive. It was sold by a pharmacy in Sparks, Nevada, of all places. Wow. And the directions, just like any other medicine, there are directions for how you're supposed to take it. And it's like an old-fashioned, like where you're taking with water.
It gave you like the recipe.
Right, exactly. It's like essentially a cocktail recipe on the label that the pharmacist had written out,
That's hysterical.
Which is kind of crazy. But yeah, I mean, it's a social experiment that really, it
didn't go well.
It was horrific and had long-ranging consequences. I mean, one of my favorite and I guess least favorite consequences is that we all pay personal income tax because of Prohibition.
I didn't know that.
So that in order to pass through the Prohibition Act, the Dries basically had to convince their colleagues in government that there'd be enough money in the Treasury because alcohol companies paid so much taxes that some of the critics of this plan were like, wait, okay, if we ban the sale of alcohol, where are we going to get money from, right? That we'd have the government will run out of money. So they were like, okay, how about if we pass a personal income tax? And they're like, oh, like that works. So we
terrible.
all pay. Yeah, exactly. So even though Prohibition is repealed, right, amazingly, of course, the personal income tax does not get repealed. It continues today, and we all pay, federal income tax. But that's why. I mean, and then you also, I think enough of us have seen Boardwalk Empire and, to see all the crime and
the mafia style.
Absolutely. It corrupts every level of, like, government. People have written about Prohibition that, like, before Prohibition, it was just crime. After Prohibition, it was organized crime, right? It gives them a purpose and a mission and the organization that it didn't have before.
We need to head to break. When we come back, we're going underground. Bathtub gin, bootleggers, and the birth of the speakeasy. Nova's going to tell us how an entire shadow economy sprang up almost overnight and why some of it was a lot closer to Capitol Hill than people realize. Stay with us. This is Culinary Confidential. We'll be back after the break.
Over the last 30 years, Newman Ferrara, a New York City law firm, has evolved into a national practice focused on real estate, commercial, litigation, civil rights, class actions, and other complex litigation, representing many of the city's largest property owners, managing agents, and thousands of tenants. Newman Ferrara handles some of the nation's most significant class actions and civil rights matters. Newman Ferrara at 55 East 59th Street, New York City. Go online to newmanferrara.com. That's newmanferrara.com. Listen to the firm's name partner, Lucas Ferrara, every Saturday at 10 a.m. on Dottie Herman's longest-running real estate radio program, Eye on Real Estate, on AM 970. A real estate lawyer for 35 years, Lucas is a professor at New York Law School and is also a published author with books on real estate and New York's landlord-tenant law. Tune in Saturdays at 10 a.m. to hear Lucas's unique perspective and advice on Eye on Real Estate.
Welcome back to Culinary Confidential with Christina Cates on AM 970, The Answer.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Christina Cates, and I'm here tonight with spirits historian and author Noah Rothbaum, talking all things Prohibition. Before the break, we talked about how the law came to be and why its loopholes were practically built in from the start. Now let's talk about what people actually did about it. Noah, welcome back. I did have one question for you. I did hear that enforcement was wildly inconsistent, right?
Sure.
Maryland basically refused to enforce the law at all. Were there other states or cities that just quietly opted out? Well, and what did that do to the law's credibility?
Yeah, I mean...
Also, while you're answing, you can start pouring all your goodies that you brought for us.
All this talk about whiskey and booze has made
makes you thirsty.
Absolutely. We're just going to, I think, we should start probably with a little bit of rye whiskey from our friends at the New York Distilling Company in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And they make a delicious rye called Jaywalk, which is made from a heirloom rye varietal called Horton, which was a local New York State rye that had fallen out of use, really, and they had gone up to New York's Cornell University up in Ithaca, New York, to their seed library. And out of like 5 or 6 seeds they propagate now, I don't know how many acres, enough for their whiskey. So
amazing!
Cheers!
Cheers! Yeah. All right, tell me about enforcing things, the enforcers.
Whiskey definitely makes such topic, I think, more interesting. Good. I think Christina likes it. All right.
Okay, I didn't die like I did the first time.
I didn't die.
Hey, that's always a very good thing.
So I guess I'm a whiskey connoisseur
Or I'm getting
now.
better at picking what you'd like.
Maybe.
But there's also one of my favorite whiskeys. So
and you said you weren't a whiskey aficionado, Christina.
I was hanging with the wrong people.
Maybe. And this is their single barrel that we're drinking, which you can visit their distillery in Williamsburg. We're talking about enforcement. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The enforcement prohibition was a mess. One of my favorite facts that I discovered, I think it was when I was reading on my new book, The Whiskey Bible, was that Winston Churchill, before he was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, he was in charge of essentially like the Royal Navy in the Caribbean, and the U.S. government said to him, hey, Winston, there are a lot of ships coming from British-controlled Caribbean full of alcohol coming into the U.S., and he was like, okay. And they're like, we don't allow alcohol anymore in the U.S. And he's like, I mean, I'm paraphrasing here. Obviously, that's not what he said.
Oh, really?
But basically what he said was, that's your problem. That's a you problem. That's not a me problem, right? And he refused to crack down on these ships going from the part of the Caribbean that the United Kingdom controlled into the U.S. waters, right? If he had cracked down, obviously that would have been a huge crackdown on one of the main supply hubs for drinkers in the U.S., but he didn't. And obviously those ships go up and down the East Coast. They go to the West Coast. The other side was that up in Nova Scotia, there are a couple of islands that are technically not Canadian. They're technically part of France. They're like just giant rock outcroppings, right, in the water. I think up until Prohibition, there were a couple dozen fishing families that lived there who would go out for cod, fairly sleepy kind of place. But somebody realized that, well, this is France. This isn't Canada. So Canadian distillers, Canada recognized our laws. So by law, their own law, they weren't allowed to ship directly to the U.S. So the Canadian distillers, at this point, one or two people had bought up all of the distilleries because they realized how lucrative it could be if, especially, they dealt in the gray area. A lot of other distillers did not want to do that, so they sold. The ones who were willing to deal in the gray realized, okay, if we ship the booze to these tiny islands that are technically France, then it is 100% legal.
See, where there's a will, there's a way.
Absolutely. Well, you're talking about loopholes. This is the greatest loophole of all, because then the U.S. got really angry. They're like, stop shipping booze to the U.S. And the Canadian distillers were like, we don't know what you're talking about. We shipped all this booze to France, to these islands. Right? And there's like almost nobody who lives on these islands. And it's like a stupid amount. The islands are now just basically warehouses full of booze. So much so that people are even, like, when they're building their homes, they're using the wooden crates that alcohol comes in, like, to panel their
Smart.
houses. Right. It's absolutely. So by law, the Canadian distillers are like, there's nothing we can do. Like, we ship it to France. Where it goes after that, we're not in control of. So essentially, they'd ship to these tiny islands, and from the tiny islands, then the booze would, of course, go right to the U.S., right? So, I mean, there are also plenty of people who are driving across the frozen Detroit River, right? Canada's Windsor, Ontario is right across from Detroit on the river, right? Supposedly there are, at least on the Canadian side, there are plenty of Model Ts that somehow broke through the ice, laden down with bottles that are still there on the bottom of the river floor. But
Time to go fishing.
Absolutely, and they're probably well preserved because the water's so cold. But
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there's all these crazy loopholes where stuff is coming in. People are dropping off, bottles along the coast of New Jersey or Long Island. They still turn up, like every so often, like a crate or a bottle will wash ashore that's been somewhere in the ocean for now almost 100 years.
That's
or 100,
crazy.
right? And people will be like, what is this bottle, right? It's all these crazy things where, I don't think people understand how wet New York was. I mean, talk about loose enforcement. There were hundreds of speakeasies, right?
Let's talk about them.
Yeah, and it's funny because, before I really started writing about the period, I think everything that I thought I knew about Prohibition was framed by, The Great Gatsby. Whether you like
in my head, that's
right,
what it's like.
Whether you like the Robert Redford version or the Leo DiCaprio version, right? Where you all think of, champagne towers and lavish
behind
parties.
a fake bookshelf or something.
Absolutely, and people are having
to knock on the door.
People are having an amazing time, and look, I mean, some of that was happening, right? So you had really the wealthiest folks who, like, some of them supposedly bought out liquor stores before Prohibition starts, right? They're well supplied. You have places like the 21 Club, which was probably New York's most famous speakeasy and bar, right? Which was open up until fairly recently.
Yeah, within the last 5 years.
Yeah, on what was 52nd Street,
Yep.
right? Which used to be called Swing Street.
And now it's just empty.
Did you ever get to go into
I did. No.
Into their, all right, so
They have a secret room?
they have a secret room. So that was left over from Prohibition.
I'll just break in now.
You could. So you'd have
make
to
it.
go, the main floor, the dining room, the ceiling, from what I remember, was covered with like Katarina Witt's ice skates and signed helmets, and CEOs would bring in a model of, was it like a trucking company, would be a truck or a plane or this or that. It was all hanging from the ceiling. If you wanted, I always wanted to go down to their cellar, and you'd have to go into the kitchen, go down like a very steep flight of stairs. And at this point, you're in a brick-lined small hallway.
Sounds like a fire hazard.
Maybe. And there was an arch. There was like a sort of an arch, set into the wall. And if you imagine you took like a piece of wire, like cut from like a coat hanger, and you put it into a tiny hole that wall would spring open as a hidden door.
Okay, this is now I'm getting angry, right? Because these are the places we have to preserve in New
Absolutely.
York, and they're dying.
Well, it's still there. I mean, so you'd go in, the door would spring open, and now you'd technically be next door, right? You were in the basement of the next building. So when the feds raided the building and say, like, do you have any alcohol on the premises? All the shelves would tip back in the bar down a chute, and the bottles would be sent out
like a movie.
Absolutely, into like the alley. The cellar wasn't actually in the 21 Club. It was in the building next to it. So they could swear on a stack of Bibles and say, no, there's no alcohol here, right? Because all the booze was technically the next building.
Again,
and you could see,
where there's a will, there's a way.
Absolutely. It was well stocked. So you had places like that had very fine booze that either they had bought before really World War One started or during World War One. You had other places that were way less glamorous. You had all types of bars, from people selling grain alcohol that would blind you or kill you in back alleys or God knows what, or cut with all types of things, to the most fancy bars and everything in between. I mean, we think of it as this glorious time to be a cocktail drinker. In reality, it was not. Like, sorry, I should have said spoiler
Right, it was a little
alert.
rough.
It could be very rough, and like it wasn't. We don't really. There's one or two drinks that are created during Prohibition, but that's about it, right? Everybody thinks when I tell them, like, oh, I write about cocktails and spirits, they always say, oh, like, Prohibition, that's when all the drinks were created. It's like, they're actually, all the drinks that we like were created before Prohibition. They're pre-Prohibition. During Prohibition was, like, for most people, kind of a horrible time to be a drinker, right? Unless you were drinking in, like, the fanciest
You're drinking like moonshine.
At best, right?
Rubbing alcohol.
And you didn't know, and every time you had a drink, you were kind of rolling the dice here, like whether this would be potable, palatable, like, or is just horrible, right? And like kill you, like, and you never really kind of knew. So again, I mean, it ran the gamut from, the most splendid drinking palaces to, back alley, bars, which is, I don't know. I'd rather drink now.
Of course. How lucky are we?
Yeah.
Okay, coming up in our final segment, we're going to talk about what Prohibition did to the way America actually drinks today. Why the cocktail as we know it might not exist without it, even though Noah thinks differently. And how a country with an empty liquor cabinet and an empty treasury finally decided enough was enough. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to Culinary Confidential with Christina Cates on AM 970 The Answer.
Over the last 30 years, Newman Ferrara, a New York City law firm, has evolved into a national practice focused on real estate, commercial, litigation, civil rights, class actions, and other complex litigation, representing many of the city's largest property owners, managing agents, and thousands of tenants. Newman Ferrara handles some of the nation's most significant class actions and civil rights matters. Newman Ferrara at 55 East 59th Street, New York City. Go online to newmanferrara.com. That's newmanferrara.com. Listen to the firm's name partner, Lucas Ferrara, every Saturday at 10 a.m. on Dottie Herman's longest-running real estate radio program, Eye on Real Estate, on AM 970. A real estate lawyer for 35 years, Lucas is a professor at New York Law School and is also a published author with books on real estate and New York's landlord-tenant law. Tune in Saturdays at 10 a.m. to hear Lucas's unique perspective and advice on Eye on Real Estate.
Welcome back to Culinary Confidential with Christina Cates on AM 970, The Answer.
Welcome back to the show. I'm Christina Cates, and we're wrapping up our Americana 250 series with Noah Rothbaum. And in this final stretch, we're talking about Prohibition's legacy, repeal, and what it permanently changed about how this country drinks. But surprise, we have a guest that just walked into the studio, Mr. Brett Thorne, who is coming on the show in a few weeks. And I actually, as I mentioned earlier in the show, met Brett through Noah.
Oh.
So we're all friends here. Or maybe I didn't mention it today.
No.
Maybe I meant to. Maybe I'll mention it on your show, Brett.
We met at Keys.
That's right. We met at Keys in the West Village. We love
kind
that
of a
bar.
Speakeasy, a modern speakeasy.
That is correct. It is. So cheers. Come in. You get a glass of whiskey. Cheers to you too, Ryan. Okay. All right, I did have another question for you, Noah.
Yeah.
Class clearly mattered, right, during
yeah.
Prohibition. Was Prohibition enforced differently depending on whether you were rich or poor?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that, those who were wealthy and had means, I mean, the laws were allowed them to drink freely and essentially openly because as long as you had already purchased your booze before Prohibition started, you could drink it, right? So that, that already allowed them, not to be prosecuted or really the laws didn't apply to them because they already had their own booze. I think it was the normal folks who were trying to go out, who didn't buy liquor stores full of stock, who had to take their chances from unreputable sources, right? That was definitely, I mean, you're definitely right. And also, the better establishments were also well-stocked. I mean, they were illegal, but, again, they had plenty of booze that they had either gotten before Prohibition or medicinal whiskey, right? I found an article, again, I think it was for my new book, The Whiskey Bible, that the New York Times had sent a reporter around the city the day that Prohibition was repealed in 1933, December 5th, and it was, Utah ratifies the repeal of the amendment, and they sent a report around the city to see what people were drinking. And it was funny because almost immediately the speakeasies were no longer popular. Nobody wanted to drink in a speakeasy. What seemed so cool was being, drinking out in public, right? And not, down in some, windowless, secret.
Right, which is why they probably still do it in Vegas these days.
And that, and people were literally busting out booze that they had bought, that they were hoarding, medicinal whiskey, stuff that they had bought before Prohibition started. You also had New York Harbor suddenly full of ships coming from, Europe. The Canadians, had warehouses and warehouses full of, mature whiskey. And at the time, you were allowed to make bourbon in Canada. So all of this was ready to go, which gave them a huge advantage. And you were talking about, we teased a little bit about the lingering effects. And I'd say that one of the lingering effects was that, it took years for the American whiskey industry to rebuild, right? After more than a dozen years of being mothballed, a lot of these distilleries had been stripped of anything valuable and sold because nobody even knew if they were going to ever reopen. So most distilleries had to be rebuilt. Right? You had all of these people who had to relearn how to distill. You couldn't really get bank loans because nobody knew if Prohibition, would go back into effect, right? So it was really kind of a wild time. And as a result, the Canadians had a huge advantage because they'd been selling booze the whole time.
Canada is sounding really desirable. This whole conversation, we've talked about the appeal.
Well, they as a result, they build distilleries across America like the Bronfmans and Hiram Walker and some of the other big Canadian drinks conglomerates. And that really shapes, in many ways, American whiskey because they begin to make whiskey in the ways that they had always made whiskey, which is sort of different than how we had made whiskey. And essentially that changes the course of booze. Also, it sort of destroys the whole career of bartenders, right? It was this very noble profession for a long time, but, became anything, kind of connected to booze becomes, thanks to Prohibition, kind of unsavory, right? And kind of, it has that, stench of corruption and impropriety and all the shenanigans that go on during Prohibition. So by the time it's repealed, we then go right into World War II, right? So the distilleries have to shut down again to make high-proof alcohol, which is used for a range of war goods, munitions and rubber and all this stuff. There is a strategic reserve of alcohol that the government assures the U.S. consumers that, we're not going to go dry. And the Caribbean, the rum distilleries don't shut down. So by the time that World War II was over, this Prohibition or quasi-prohibition has been all the way from the beginning of World War I. So it's way longer of a period than we normally think. So by the time that in earnest things get rebooted after World War II, it takes years for the distilleries in America to start producing aged, whiskey. Churchill, in his infinite wisdom, starts to give distillers in Scotland a share of grain so they can restart even before the official end of World War II, which also allows them to help pay back their debt, right? Because the war was so costly, and this was one of the big economic drivers. And Scotch is, obviously a product that's exported and sold in foreign markets, so that would help them. But really, it's, until the 50s do we get, once again, like a consistent and high-quality supply of alcohol, which is part of the reason I think that tequila has a moment then, vodka has a moment, right? You have all these other spirits coming on.
What a way we've come.
Right.
I mean, in 2026, from the 1950s, which wasn't so long ago.
Absolutely. I mean, and even then it was not, I think Don Draper and Mad Men, we have
the power lunch.
Right, the
three martini lunch.
Exactly. And it wasn't.
Boy, was I born in the wrong era. I tell you.
And it wasn't, I think we have this idea that this is amazing craft cocktail. But even the 50s, it was great martinis, tiki, right? After all the horrors of, the two world wars and the Depression and even a pandemic, people were looking for escapism, right? That's, Hawaii becomes a state. You have the Elvis movie, Blue Hawaiian. People want fantasy, right? They want to escape from their everyday and everything
and just
that they've
experiential
experienced.
dining even.
Absolutely. So you get, Trader Vic's, and he even had a Mexican version, right, that he was starting, and all these restaurants in New York that are, trying to promote, kind of food from different places. And again, people are just trying to get out of their everyday. And when you think about it, there are even food shortages in the UK, and that's where Ian Fleming and James Bond, becomes so popular in the 50s because the UK is still building. London is destroyed in all the Blitz bombings, and there isn't enough food. So people, this idea of the Caribbean, the sunshine and endless booze and food and beautiful people becomes very, very appealing.
Absolutely. All right, Ryan, let me ask you a question. How much time do we have before the show's over?
We got about 10 minutes or so.
Okay, so I normally do an ingredient of the week, but we're going to skip that this week because we have a whole other whiskey that you brought that we haven't even opened, tasted, or talked about.
Yes.
And it's a little Americana, so I think we should definitely...
If there was ever a time for this whiskey,
absolutely.
I think it's
we got to bring it into the mix.
Well, I brought with me, in addition to the Jaywalk Heirloom Rye, a bottle from Lost Lantern. They're kind of independent bottlers based up in Vermont, to a former journalist and a former buyer for a liquor store in New York. Sort of based their idea on sort of Scottish companies. In Scotland, for many, many years, you had these so-called independent bottlers who would buy barrels of whiskey from different distillers, and then they would bottle it and put it out themselves. So Lost Lantern up in Vermont has a similar idea where they work with craft distillers around the U.S., where they buy a barrel or two and bottle it as these special reserves. But for this year, for America 250, they did something that, to be honest, I think is kind of crazy. I didn't even know it was possible, but they got bourbon that was made in all 50 states and blended it together. Right, they have a few different versions. This is the 100 proof one.
So that's the one that will kill me?
Well, they have a cask strength one, which is even higher. So I thought you would like the 100 proof version. But yeah, it was a really ambitious project because up until recently, I don't think that you could have even found bourbon from all 50 states. So the fact that they went and they found bourbon that they liked, and then they had to put it all together into a blend.
So this is
really
a perfect
cool.
little bourbon baby.
Exactly. It's truly a reflection of bourbon distillers in America right now. Should we...
Ryan, we have no more cups?
Should we dump into
I'm going to have to dump. It might take one.
I get some more cups if we need to.
Now, we're going to improvise because, you know what? If they could improvise during Prohibition, we can figure it out.
Absolutely.
That's the spirit.
That's the spirit. Our glasses are nice and marinated.
Exactly. A little...
Thank you.
This one I'm going to dump into your dump bucket.
My Starbucks dump bucket.
Although the rye is so good, and especially as the ice melts, it really opens up a little bit, which people...
Are you just going to shoot that, Brett?
You know what? I'm going to nurse this because it is good.
And
then I'll have some...
Perfect.
What's it called? Lost Lantern.
Lost Lantern,
Lantern from Vermont.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Come on. I'm sure you have a good cheers.
You mean like? I mean, there are lots. I mean, they're not all good. I'll tell you that.
Give me your most common one.
How many? There's always the favorite, which is my wife's family's favorite. There are fast ships. There are slow ships, but the best ships are friendships.
Love that. And look at this friendship,
Look at
how
that.
it's
Look at
bloomed.
that. Look at that. Cheers. Cheers
You've
to
made
that.
me a whiskey drinker. Pagano. Okay, let's give it a taste. So, turns out
you're more of a rye drinker.
the ice makes a huge difference.
Absolutely.
Pay's having ice here. What can I say? So
Yes.
All right, give us some of those.
Let's get some ice here.
Those flavored
Yeah.
notes,
Well, I mean, I think
tasting
you
notes.
see the difference. I mean, the rye whiskey in the modern era, in our modern era now, is known usually for that kind of big hit of black pepper and spice. I'd say the Jaywalk is more tempered, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe that heirloom varietal that they're using, which each cluster of grain is smaller, but I'd say it's more flavorful. But the difference between rye and bourbon, as we were talking about before, is obviously more corn in bourbon. So you get a whole different flavor profile here of corn, right? And again, I mean, it's 100 proof, which, water helps open it up a little bit. So, as folks like to say, American whiskey laughs at ice and water. So feel free. It's hot.
I think American whiskey laughs at Christina Cates.
It's hot here. It's not hot in Scotland. They don't need ice there. But here we need ice, right? It could be 100 degrees in New York City, as it was the other day. It could be
disgusting.
More than that in Nevada, California, Texas. So we need ice here, right? Scotland is 65 degrees. They don't care about ice.
Yeah.
Right? They don't need ice.
The glass
We
gets a
need
little
ice.
chilled
Right, no,
out in the open air.
They think one tiny cube is ice. Like here, like we're Americans. We want ice.
We need the
right?
king cube.
We need giant cubes and a lot of them. But our whiskey's made for that, right? And it's actually a good thing. Don't be afraid to do that. Whiskey is a delicious drink in the summer, especially if you add ice or mixers. So your listeners should feel inspired and empowered to drink the whiskey.
And
the way they
lucky that
want.
we can drink
Oh, yeah.
out in the open.
Absolutely.
And not in some basement behind a trap door.
Right, exactly. Never knowing if we're going to leave that basement again.
That's right. Okay, thank you for listening to Culinary Confidential with Christina Cates, Sunday nights at 9 p.m. on AM 970 The Answer. And that brings us to the end of tonight's show and the end of our Americana 250 series. What a month it's been. We kicked things off with Jay Rifle talking about the culinary time capsule, tracing American food all the way from 1776 to 2026. Then we sat down with Chef Robert Irvine to talk about his work with veterans through the Robert Irvine Foundation and what it really means to feed the people who've served this country. Last week, we had Scott Lebedo, the patriotic artist out of Staten Island, alongside cowboy chef Kent Rollins, talking about patriotism, chuck wagons, and cooking over an open fire the way it's been done for generations. And tonight, we wrapped it all up with Noah Rothbaum, going deep into Prohibition, one of the strangest, messiest chapters in the story of how America eats and drinks. 250 years of food in 1 month of shows. That's not a bad way to mark this country's birthday. Noah, thank you so much for closing it out with us. If you want more from Noah, look for the Whiskey Bible and check out the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails if you really want to go down the rabbit hole. Next week, we're trading whiskey for olive oil. I'll be joined by Susan Julia, a certified olive oil sommelier who's going to teach us how to actually taste extra virgin olive oil the way the professionals do, what separates a $40 bottle from an $80 one, and why so much of what's on grocery store shelves isn't what it claims to be. If you've ever wondered whether your olive oil is the real deal, you will not want to miss this one. I do want to mention that New York City Restaurant Week kicked off a few days ago and runs until August 16th. This is a great way to check out a restaurant at a prefixed price. Head to nyctourism.com to learn more and see which restaurants are participating. But Noah, thank you again for coming on the show. You know I am obsessed with you, and I am now a whiskey drinker. So cheers one more time to that.
Thank you for
Brett,
having
thanks
me.
for popping in the studio.
No, thanks for having me.
I'm Christina
Cheers to
Cates.
that.
This has been Culinary Confidential. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. Have a good night.
The preceding program is sponsored by Shake It Off Live, LLC.